My name is Eugenia Kim, Eugenia Sun Hee Kim. I was born in 1952, so I am 72 years old, and I was born in White Plains, New York. My parents came over in 1948, which is unusual because it was right after the Pacific War and right before the Korean War. Long story about how my parents came over at that time, but suffice it to say, they came over with 2 out of 3 children. They left one behind in Korea because she was just 1 year old, and they thought grandmother was so upset that they were leaving. Even though they were just coming here for a year, they left the one daughter behind. So they came to the U.S. on a ship. My father was working for the U.S. military government in Korea, so he had privileges that allowed him to come on transport. So they landed in L.A., where my father's brother lived. They were both ministers, and they stayed there for a year, had another child, came to the East Coast. My father was offered a job with the Voice of America. He was fluent in Korean, Japanese, of course, and English, because they both grew up entirely during the Japanese occupation period. He was known in the translating community, so he got a job with the Voice of America, and at that time it was in New York. And so my sister, number 5, was born there at number 6. I was number 6. We only lived there 3 years, and then we moved to the Washington area, Tacoma Park, right outside of, right just north of D.C. And I spent all my childhood years in Tacoma Park, from 3 until 6th grade. My father, being a minister of the First Methodist Korean Church in Washington, he was a leader in the early Korean American community in Washington. So I had a lot of contact with the community, but I had no Korean language except for garlic and, clean your room, and there's so much hair in the house, things like that. I was surrounded by Koreans every Sunday, most Saturdays, usually Wednesday nights, often in the house. It was always with some annoyance on my part that Koreans were so involved in my family life. I was Korean American. I didn't really, and having no language, being forced to sit in church every Sunday for an hour and a half, listening to my father's sermons. It was just torture. And my mom, too, was very involved in the community, of course, as a Korean American leader. So he worked at the Voice of America, and she worked making kimchi, selling it to the 3 Asian restaurants in Washington, the Yenching Palace, Jenny's, which was a Japanese restaurant, another Japanese restaurant in Silver Spring. So lots of hours spent making kimchi with my mother in big tubs like this, and, arms all the way in, doing the cabbage, putting it in jars, delivering kimchi every Sunday. Yeah, it was a lot. But it was a great introduction to culture, and having been ingrained deeply in the food culture and in the Korean culture, we learned Korean dance, everything but the language. So it's sort of weird. So that, of course, led to me feeling like an imposter much later in my life. I had everything but the language. My parents were always busy, and I was given a lot of freedom because they were tired. I was given a lot more freedom than my siblings. And so I would go off for hours after school and not be missed. But that began a pattern of both feeling freedom and feeling abandoned at the same time, which was kind of played out in my 20s in very negative ways. College was all art and experimental drugs, and just sort of a wild, lost period. And a lot of it was because I had no sense of who I was. What does it mean to be who you are? Who are you? I couldn't answer that question. I had no idea what that meant. And so the drug use was a way to try to mitigate that and to try to find out what that was. After college, which I just scraped through with C's and D's, even though all my other siblings were straight A students, I was the black sheep. I knew I was in trouble. And my family knew I was in trouble, but they didn't know what to do. So my Korean sister, she invited me to come down and live with her, which was fantastic because I didn't know what I was going to do. So I moved down to Miami with her, and those were some really good years. We got very close during that time. I started working in a restaurant in downtown Miami, the Red Coach Grill, and moved up in that business in hospitality for about 4 years. She, in the meantime, moved to Hawaii. So then I lived by myself in Miami for a couple of years, and then in Fort Lauderdale for a couple of years when the restaurant moved me north. And for one entire summer, I was homeless. Every penny I made went towards saving money so that I could put a down payment on an apartment in Fort Lauderdale. I became homeless because I got mixed up with a Romanian boy who used the word back then, gypsy. They basically took every penny I earned until I could finally break it off, understand what had happened to me, broke it off, was homeless in my 1962 turquoise blue station wagon. So I had a station wagon. At least I could put my clothes in there and live out of my car. And after that, I thought, you know what? I got to straighten up. So I came back home. I had a high school boyfriend that I had gone to the prom with, Jeff. And he was eager to have me home too, because we had been writing letters. And so that was a reason for me to go home. I married my high school boyfriend, Jeff. And then we had, that was my 30s. In my 30s, we just had, that was the partying 30s, disco every night and dinner parties and friends, and moved into Washington with him. And then moved careers from the hospitality to an art gallery, and then finally to becoming a graphic designer, which is where I found was comfortable because I could be creative, I could be mechanical, which I like. And during that period, I got pregnant. I was 39. So it was late. I was going to be a high-risk pregnancy. I had surgery at 4 months because they thought it was a hernia. They opened me up, closed me right back because it wasn't a hernia. It was uterine fibroids. So, and that was crowding the baby. That was crowding the uterus. So he was premature. I learned later they had been able to give me steroids during that period. So his lungs were fully developed. So he could breathe on his own. We were so grateful that he was breathing on his own. He was so cute with this huge black head of hair and all bundled up. But there were things that were wrong. He was not eating well. He wasn't moving properly. So it was predicted that he would never walk, is what they were saying, because his muscles were really floppy and loose. He wasn't feeding. But one of the things that I was concerned about was, did all my drug use cause his disabilities? We didn't know what his disability was. As time passed, we recognized that he had cognitive disabilities as well as physical disabilities. They called it cerebral palsy and also mental retardation. Those were the categories they put him in when he was about 3 or 4 years old, which was great because we got services from the city, from the District of Columbia as a result of that. Our attitude about my son Van has always been, we will take our cues from him, have no expectations of him except for let him do the best that he can. Our attitude about that to the experiences that both my husband and I had at that time, he had as difficult youth as I did. He's a white guy. He grew up in Thailand and Korea. His parents were in the Foreign Service. So he had sort of the opposite experience that we did. So when we met in high school, he gravitated towards me as an Asian person. So his identity issues were kind of opposite, but kind of the same. And which is one of the reasons why we connected so well. And also one of the reasons why we could look at our child who was different, both racially and cognizantly and all these other, being a different person entirely, and just see, well, let's see what he's going to tell us. For my mother, having a son with disabilities was a big deal. She remembers hearing about children who were obviously disabled at birth were left in the woods. So when I showed all this care and all this medical care, millions in dollars of medical care going to this one baby, and she would come to the ICU. My father had already passed by then. and see everything that was being done for him. And then she would also see our devotion to him. It changed her mind completely about people who were different. And she wrote a poem that was published in the Korean newspaper here, and my sister translated it for me, and it was just beautiful. It made me think that I had been able to give something to my mother as well. For all that she did for me, I could give her this gift of seeing the world in a slightly different way, even at her age of, how old was she? She was in her late 80s by then. Yeah. So what started to happen was when my son was young, I wasn't able to be creative. I wasn't able to do art. I was still doing graphic design. I had to quit my job at the public broadcasting service. My husband was, at the time, a lawyer, a new lawyer, brand new. So he was working at a very demanding firm. He would work during the day. I'd take care of the baby. He'd come home. I'd work. So it was a difficult period of time for us. My husband and I divorced when my son was 3. He came out as a gay man, and difficult 1-2 years, but we were best friends from high school. So we swore to have a loving relationship no matter what. And we are still best friends to this day. Lucky thing for me, I met another man, and that's my current husband, Brian. So my first husband, I was married 16 years. My current husband, we're at 26. Feeling the need, a really desperate need to be creative that wasn't about my job, I started to write. And the first thing I wrote was a story my mother had told me about her father's burial. And then I realized, you know what, this writing thing is very interesting. It's making me look at my mother in a different way. I'm beginning to feel a connection to the stories she would tell about Korea in a way that I had never been interested in before. So I began to pursue that. And I took classes. My son was often in beds, and I had the time to write. I could find the time to write. And I realized that this story is bigger than I am, my grandfather's story, because it's about my mother, it's about Korea, it's about my grandfather, whom I never met, whom I never knew. I saw his picture. I didn't know anything. I knew nothing. I had never taken a Korean history class, Korean language class. I had had no interest in Korea up until that point when I started writing my mother's story. So that morphed into my getting a Master's of Fine Arts degree in creative writing so that I could explore what these stories are about. I started to research. And by the time the book was published in 2009, I had read 400 books. I had been to Korea twice. And then I began to understand history, ancient history, tradition, culture, Confucianism, the onset of Christian, awareness in Korea. So much I began to understand. And through that process, when I went to get my MFA, my question that I came into the writing program with was, I didn't want to be pigeonholed as a Korean American writer. I was like, I wanted to be recognized just for being, who I was. Well, I came out of the program realizing that I am a Korean American writer. Hello. And a lot of that was because of the research I had done. I recognized, you know what? There's no shame in being Korean American. There's no issue with that. Just embrace finally who you are. And so through the process of writing that first novel and doing all that research and going to Korea twice, I understood that even though I am not very Korean at all, I am Korean American. And because of my own unique Korean American experience, many other people who have their own unique Korean American experiences, I am adding to what that means. Which is why I appreciate your organization, because it is about our stories. It's the only way through which we're going to be able to have any inner peace. And so the best way to reach that is through creativity. My name is Eugenia Kim, and this is my Korean American story.